Hello and welcome to this video. Today I want to talk about a few keywords. I want to mainly focus on public and private, but I also want to mention the other keywords like static, protected and constant, and I want to talk about the keywords that are not existing in C#, like signed and unsigned. Okay, so let's start with our important keyword called public. As you can see, we always use this keyword, but we never talked about it. You know what class YouTube means, but you don't know what public means. Okay, let's start with an example. Let's create two variables, one private and one public. And to start, I want to explain to you that private is only accessible by all members of this class, and public is exactly the opposite. It's accessible by all other classes as well. And that's the same for methods as well. So if I create, for example, a method that is private and one method that is public, I can call the private method only from this class or from other methods inside this class. So for example, I can call the private method from our start method here, but I can call the public method from every other class as well, even if this other class is in another file. If you want, you could also change the public modifier here for our class YouTube, but it's important to mention that a class can only be private if it's nested within another class. The next important thing to notice when you are working with public and private variables in the Unity editor is that the public variables are visible and accessible and also changeable, of course, in the Unity editor, and the private variables are not accessible or visible in the Unity editor by default. I explicitly say by default because if you activate the debug mode, then you can at least see the private variables, but you still can't change them. So as you can see here, our public variable var public is visible, but the var private is not visible and we can't see it here for our script. It's also important to mention that you should not overuse public just to make variables visible in the Unity editor. If you just want to make a variable visible in the Unity editor, you just use serialized fields. And if you want to use a variable from another class, then you can use public. But otherwise, just use serialized field. Okay, let's hop back to Visual Studio. I know I just quickly cut on the serialized field and the inspector debug mode, but I want to talk more about this in our Unity series, but in the C# series I want to focus on the C# part and I want to explain everything about C#, but serialized field and all the other attributes as well as the debug mode for inspector I want to talk about in detail in our Unity series. So let's quickly repeat what we learned. So var private is not seeable in the Unity editor, except you go to debug mode, of course. And var private is only accessible inside our class YouTube. And the method private is also only accessible from our class YouTube, whereas the method public is accessible from all the other classes as well, except they are in another namespace, but we will talk about that in a later video. Okay, to show you an example, I want to create another file, so you also see that it's possible to call from another file and not only from another class that is in the same file. So let's create another file called second file, and let's create an instance of our class YouTube. So let's create an object called test, and then if we enter test, you can already see that the autocorrection only shows us method public, not method private. And that's exactly what I mentioned before. The private method is only callable inside our class YouTube, whereas the public method is accessible from another class as well. And that's why we can access it in this class second file, and we can't access the private method in the class second file because it's private and it can only be accessed in the class YouTube. So if I write two commands here, one to access method private and one to access method public, you can see that method private gets underlined red because it's not accessible, so it's an error, and method public is totally fine to go. And the same goes for the variables as well. So as you can see, if I write, like I did here, two debug log statements, one for var public and one for var private, only the one with var public is correct. The one with var private is incorrect because it can't find the variable var private. So as you can see, it's the same for the variables as it is for the methods. Okay, and now I quickly want to talk about protected. I don't want to go into too much detail about that because we didn't talk about derived classes for now, but I just want to mention that protected is only accessible from its own class and from all classes that derive from this class. The next thing that I want to explain is the keyword static, which is a bit more complicated. So let's change this variable here to static and rename it to var public static. And to explain to you what static is actually doing, I want to give you an example. So if I, for example, create 5 instances of the class YouTube, the variable var private can be different in every one of these instances. Okay, I know right now we don't have a setter method for var private, but this is just an example. So var private can be different in each of these instances, and var public static will be the same in each of these instances at every point in time. So for example, our variable var private could have the value 5 at instance A and the value 10 at instance D. But our variable var public static would all the time have the same value in all instances at the same time. So for example, var public static can be 15 in instance D after we changed it, and just the second we changed it in instance D, it would also have the value 15 in instance A. So basically, a static variable acts like a shared variable via all the instances. So basically, instance A, B, C, D, E all share the same value for the variable var public static. Okay, the next point about static I can directly show you for methods and variables at the same time. So let's make this method here static as well, and let's hop into our second file. Because the next thing that changed for our variable and method after we made them static is the way how it can be accessed from outside of the class. Now that our variable and method are static, they can only be accessed via the class name YouTube and then a dot, and then you can access them. But you can't access them anymore via an instance. So as you can see, I can write youtube.methodPublicStatic, and I can access our method that is static now just via the class name YouTube. But as you can see, I can't access it anymore via our instance test. And that goes for variables and methods in the same way. So both the variable and the method can't be accessed via our instance anymore after they are static. And with that, I mean read and write. So you can't read the variable and you can't write the variable via an instance, but you can now read and write the variable or call the method via the class name YouTube. And the third most important thing that I want to mention about the keyword static is that if you make a class static, then everything inside this class, so every variable and every method, needs to be static as well. Otherwise, the compiler will throw you an error. And as you can see, now that I made our class YouTube static, the private variable and the private method are getting an error because both of them are still private and they need to be public static. It can't be private static, it needs to be public static. Okay, and now both of them are still just private, so they are not complying with the rule that every member of a static class needs to be static as well. But there's more. The start method is underlined red as well. And of course, the start method is not static, but it is also private right now. And now you may ask yourself, why is the start method private right now? And that's pretty simple, because if you don't add any keyword in front of a method, then it is private by default. Okay, let's not talk about why mono behavior is underlined red right now. I want to talk about this in a later video, but for now, that is all that I want to mention about static. Okay, let's quickly put it in the state that it was before, and then I want to talk about two keywords that are not existing in C#. I already quickly mentioned that in the variables video, but now I want to dive into that topic in a bit more detail. If you come from another programming language, then you maybe know the keywords unsigned and signed. So I quickly want to explain what signed and unsigned was meaning again. So signed is a variable that can have positive and negative values, and unsigned is a variable that can only have positive values, but therefore it has a larger range of positive values. And based on my definition, you may already guessed it, this is only working for numerical data types. Okay, but like I already mentioned, you don't have the keywords signed and unsigned, so in C# you create an unsigned integer with uint and a signed integer just by writing int. And this is the same for short and long as well. You can write ushort for an unsigned short and ulong for an unsigned long. And for byte it's a bit different, because for byte its default state is unsigned, and if you want to have a signed byte, then you need to use sbyte. And last, I want to show you the keyword const, which is used to create a constant variable. So let's create a constant variable. Constant variables are also often used as config variables, and if you do so, it is a convention to write it all in uppercase and to use underscores instead of white spaces, because you can't use camel case anymore to show the difference between two words. And the variable where you use the constant keyword in front is read-only after you define its value once. So as you can see here in the declaration, we can define its value once, but if I try to change the value now in the start method, as you can see, it throws me an error because I can't change the value anymore. However, if I use debug log now to log the value, that's totally fine because the value is read-only, so you still can read it, but you can't change it anymore. Also, there are two more things to mention about constant variables. The first one is pretty obvious. You can't use the static modifier on them because it will be the same value anyways on all the class instances because it can't be changed anymore. So it makes no sense to use the static modifier. And the second thing is that the only reference type that is allowed as a constant variable is a string. Okay, that's it for this video. The goal of the video was for you to understand how private, public, constant, static, signed and unsigned are working in C#, and I hope you did so, and I see you in the next video. Welcome to the end of this video. Hit the subscribe button to stay updated. Also, if you need some high quality assets for your game or like our channel and want to support us, feel free to check out our assets at the Unity or Unreal Asset Store. You'll find the link to our store pages in the description. I hope you learned something new and see you next time.